Hello and welcome to the Big Baby Podcast. I'm your host, as ever, Gahoole. Here with me today, my co-host, the DAIYMO, Ethan Hatchet. How's it going?
Hi, how are you?
Good, doing good, buddy. What's life treating ya? You watch any good movies this week?
I've been watching the HBO series The Sympathizer. It's been executive produced by Park Chan-wook and Robert Downey Jr., directed by Park Chan-wook. So far, it's pretty good. It's a playful little series about the Vietnam War.
I didn't watch it because I saw Robert Downey Jr. in a bunch of goofy costumes, and I thought, this looks like gook crap. I don't watch gook crap, so I skipped it.
Oh.
No, oh, fuck, man. Anyways, today's topic we're going to talk about Cowboys versus Samurai. Obviously, I'll be talking about Cowboys, and DAIYMO will also be talking about Cowboys. No, he'll be talking about Samurai. I thought we should do this topic because there's a very strange, I guess it's kind of an obvious, there's a very big overlap between samurai movies and Western films, both in terms of like them remaking each other, stories having very similar, setups and layouts. They kind of mirror each other, like not so aesthetically, but like story wise, theming wise, and setup and like payoff wise. It's very. A lot of the best westerns are based off samurai movies, and some of the best samurai movies are based off westerns. So, yeah, what do you think about that? Why don't you get off first, DAIYMO? Talk about samurai movies for a little bit.
Why, thank you, Gahoole. Well, I think the reason why samurai and cowboys, so-called cattle rustlers, drifters, and such are paired together are they both sort of embody the respective nations' mythos. So samurais are the Japanese sort of ideal of what a man should be, and then cowboys are the American ideal of what a man should be.
Okay.
And I say mythos because they're both largely based on lies. That for the most part, samurai were just, hired thugs. They had a little bit more education, but they weren't quite as noble as, we would all hope and like them to be. The cowboys are almost entirely fabricated because they were just people that moved cows around when they weren't just sort of drifting criminals. So like the modern conception of a movie cowboy is probably completely wrong. It's probably more like Blood Meridian. That's probably why they're always paired together, aside from like their movie counterparts, because they are sort of the embodiment of a nation in a person.
That's probably true. I think there's also something to the fact that they both embody a time period in both nations' history of pretty much like large chaos and also freedom, if that makes sense. Samurai existed in like a lot of the warring states periods where there wasn't as much of a centralized government in the countries in Japan, and a lot of like the feudal law was enforced by samurai, and these people were essentially swords for hire, right? That gain like land or title or prestige through their acts. And like cowboys existed primarily, like the Wild West was when the people were moving west from the eastern colonies, and they were kind of going out into the country. There was not a lot of civilization to back them up. It wasn't like nowadays where you can call people, there's like phones and all that. They were kind of just out on their own, so the law was not really with them, which so in both situations it's a lot of idealizing. It's not just idealizing the characters of cowboys and samurai, but also the settings of both. They're both like time periods in both of these countries, both Japan and the US's history of a lot of chaos, but also simultaneously a lot of freedom. And in some ways, it's kind of like an escapist fantasy to like want to live in this like hardened, almost like simpler, less complicated time of basically whether you could get away with a ton of shit. Like you can just get away with murder in the Wild West, you know, for a lot of times, and no one could. You could just like move west and go to a different town, and no one would stop you. You know,
You can still do that.
well, I mean, I guess you're the thug for hire here now. We're talking about, but
I'm just saying theoretically.
But it's not as common. It's not like, you know, it's not something people really worry about. You know, people don't really worry about death that much. But there's like less. There was so much more freedom back then to move and kind of live around and be yourself. You know, and not really be yourself, but like, you know what I'm saying, right? There was like that ability to like, you didn't have to be. There's not as many rules to follow. It was a time where you would make it on your own, kind of thing, and that was that. I think that's both. I think it's a weird fantasy in everyone's mind that they want to go back.
It is like it's the rugged individual,
right?
They make their own rules. They live their own way,
right? And I think it's a fantasy to want to escape to live like that, especially in a time period where, especially when these movies were being made and these stories were being written, it's very much so a rigid, very structured life that almost everyone lives in most modern America and Japan, you know. It's very much, you know, go to work, do your job, you get your pay. There's not a lot of moving about and change and random, and there's not a lot of individual like momentum. It's very much like you're at the direction of your bosses or who's in control of your life at the moment, you know.
So now we have to smear the other side, I think.
Well, I will say this. I think there's a lot of conceptions that the modern Western comes from samurai movies, which I think there is some truth to that a lot of the modern Westerns, you know, like the Dollars trilogy or stuff like Magnificent Seven or Tombstone, or even to some extent, I don't know, talking about, but a lot of that was like the shots, how their movies are made, the storylines, they come from Japanese samurai films. But I would argue a lot of the Japanese samurai films that people think in reference to that are being remade into Westerns kind of had their identity come from American Westerns in the first place. Like John Ford style Westerns and like movies from like the early 50s that, you know, and 40s that were the cowboy Westerns of that time were kind of like what laid the foundation for a lot of the Kurosawa era samurai films. And a lot of it's not just a one way where the Western Americans rip off the Japanese samurai movies. I think it's back and forth. I think a lot of the origin point comes from the John Ford Western. I think that's actually where I think a lot of the ideas of like that type of samurai movie don't even come from Japanese history. They come from like ideas present in American Wild West stories. Actually, I don't think it's as much. Or even though the Japanese films establish a lot of like the camera and like cinematography style language of these movies, I think most of the actual narratives come from American Westerns.
I would counter with that. Yes, there is influence from the West in these Japanese films, but most of the all-time classic Western films are shot-for-shot copies of the samurai films. While there may be influence from Western film, because I mean, film was invented in the West, a lot of the structures and the storylines and sort of the core ethos does originate from Japan. It was already there. They were already doing it on stage or in writing. Whereas you can't cut this out. Where
No. I'm not cutting that out.
No, in the podcast right now. I lost my train of thought. But the point being that this idea, this ethos, this aesthetic already existed in Japan before cinema. So to say that it originated from Western films, I think is just entirely incorrect.
I guess I would.
But this ethic did not exist in America before we knew about Japan.
I'm going to disagree with you on that one. I think a lot of this. I think we're talking. I thought if we're talking just film, if we want to go pre-film, I think there's definitely the argument to be made that a lot of the modern sensibilities of what a samurai is the rugged traveler who comes into town, and the lone swordsman who comes into town and saves them from the evil evil bandits in the area, right? I think it's like the classic samurai archetype, and it's also the classic samurai Western archetype. It's like the very most basic fundamentals of a Western story. It's a outsider comes in and he sets up and stops the evil bandits, right? I mean, would you disagree with that? That's like the foundation for a good chunk of samurai and Western fiction. Am I wrong on that?
It's the foundation for like Kurosawa films, but I wouldn't say for all samurai medium.
I mean, it's also the foundation for like Lone Wolf and Cub. Most of those, movies that I've seen, it's very similar. I mean, those are kind of almost episodic, where like the samurai travel from area to area with his son, and then they kind of solve problems in those areas for people. I guess those are later movies; those aren't as early as Kurosawa. But a lot of that kind of storytelling. I mean, obviously we can go back to John Ford. I think John Ford predates a lot of the stuff. He predates. I mean, does he predate Kurosawa even? I don't. I have to double check.
That's a good question.
I'm gonna pull up when Seven Samurai was released, because it's early. Seven Samurai is 1954, and I think John Ford was doing movies in like
he was doing movies in the 40s.
Stagecoach is 1939, and I think Stagecoach is like maybe like the quintessential classic Western film, because I would consider the American language for the Western comes from John Ford, who when he was releasing movies was just making movies to make movies, but like he kind of established a lot of the ideas in film of like the American Western. But a lot of the ideas of those American Westerns come from like dime store novels. Like they come from like pretty like kind of like, I don't want to say Pulp Fiction, but like classic you'd read in like magazines or serials, like these basic Western stories from the late 1800s. Even it was going back to that, and I think those probably got over to Japan as well. I think that I think a lot of the mythos and like the setup of this drifter style samurai doesn't come from Japanese history as much, and doesn't come from American history either, to be fair. These are just like stories that have come up over time. It's kind of like stories they would tell each other. I think a lot of the structure and foundation came more from the cowboy and Western stories from those dime store novels that made their way over, like the ideals of those over to Japan. I don't think it was. I don't see any Japanese influence in Stagecoach. I'm going to be honest. I don't think there may be minute, maybe, but I don't see a lot of samurai style film influence in Stagecoach or those movies, and I consider those the foundational works of cowboy films in America. So I don't necessarily agree that it comes. I guess the question would be. But the thing is, if you look at what like are the quintessential classic Westerns now, most of them are like the late Westerns, like the 70s and the 80s Westerns, like the Dollar Trilogy, and Magnificent Seven, Tombstone, True Grit, the Coen Brothers True Grit, and the original John Ford True Grit. But if you look at if you want to say who started the thing, I think that you can make an argument either way. I would argue that it comes more from an actual American Westerns than it comes from Japanese film. But you could make the argument that I wouldn't deny the argument that most of the classic Westerns are shot-for-shot remakes of samurai movies. You're right about that. But my argument would be, are these stories not... In a way, they feel more like they feel more like cowboy movies. They feel more like stuff that's set in American Western. They would be set in the history of Japan. They feel more at place in the history of an American town than they do in the history of a Japanese town.
Why do you say that?
Well, I mean, just the culture of like, I mean, you think of like Seven Samurai, right? This like isolated village in the Japanese countryside or wilderness, basically, that these samurai have to come in and they have to stop these bandits from taking over, right? that doesn't seem, because of the geographic nature of Japan, such a smaller place than the American Western frontier was. I mean, how is it reasonable to expect? Was that a common occurrence back then, that like these villages were so cut off from each other civilizationally that they would be at the mercy of these bandits, like they would be? Whereas like in the American West, it's actually a real, that like geographically it makes sense that way, because there's so much distance and space between these towns. Whereas I just don't, like, you could, I know Japan's not as small as it seems on the map, because it's a quite a large country, especially compared to some European countries, but it's not nearly as big as, I don't know, I just, maybe it's because there was population decline, maybe be the argument for that, but it just doesn't feel like would have been like a very common occurrence back then to me.
Well, there wasn't a centralized, especially during like the Warring States and where a lot of this stuff takes place, or the Edo period, really, there wasn't a centralized government. It's not like there was a federal government to make sure everything was peaceful. It was essentially feudalism, so there was like a lord, and the competence of this lord, or if the lord would just let thugs raid people for taxes and whatnot, sort of at their discretion. So it's not implausible.
Okay. But like, I mean, would a lord let bandits like ransack one of his towns? I mean, that's kind of the plot of the Seventh Samurai. Would that be something he would let happen? You know, I mean, it's in his land. I mean, how far strung out are these areas, right?
I mean, even in like wartime, if you win and you can't pay your troops, that's one way to pay them.
Is you have them just raid the land?
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. So maybe it would have been a common occurrence for these Japanese villagers to be raided frequently and have their possessions stolen.
Because I mean, with their class system, like they're peasants. Like, who cares?
Right. It just, to me, like the you might have a point with that. Okay, but still, I don't think. I think personally, there is something to say that I think the stories of the Japanese samurai, I think they pull quite a bit more from American Western stories than initially is obvious. I think that they both pull both ways. I don't think it's just American Westerns are just stealing from the samurai films. I don't think that's accurate.
What do you think about like the 47 Ronin? Do you think that sounds like a very Western idea for a story?
What, the one with Keanu Reeves?
Well, just the story of it. It was a remake of a Japanese film.
What's the story of the 47 Ronin?
Basically, their lord gets killed, and so they have to avenge their master's honor by killing the person who killed them.
I mean, yeah, that seems like almost like a universal story. I feel like you could set that in like any setting, really, and have it kind of apply. You know, I mean, especially like you could say like, oh, like our cavalry colonel, you know, like say like you have like the Rough Riders, like Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders, say like one of their colonels gets killed, like when out like by like the Indians come and they kill one of their colonels, and they have to go to the Indian tribe and find and kill the Indian people who kill them, you know.
So this was a legend that was made into a film that circulated in the West as early as 1871. So this sort of Japanese structure to a story has been around for a while, and it does sound like a Western.
I guess it does sound like a Western, but it also sounds like something you could set in Shakespearean times. It sounds like something. The actual story sounds like something that could predate something that comes from Japan. I don't necessarily think that it has to be.
Well, sure. I'm just saying that like this sort of structure of a samurai film or samurai story has been around longer than film.
True, and I mean, I guess the difference is that the samurai period occurred much earlier historically than the Western, you know, the cowboy Western, which is a very short time historically. Actually, I mean, it's like what, like the it basically takes place from. I mean, I think this the Western story probably takes place like the mid to late 1800s. That's like basically the time frame it takes place in. You know, by the time you get to the early 20th century, it's basically done. And I mean, you have the time around the Civil War. I mean, you kind of have to go almost like end of Civil War era, basically, till like it's like a 50-year time span. It's not that long,
I would agree that a lot of the cinematography, a lot of the film language itself probably is borrowed directly from Westerns, but I don't think the story structure is directly borrowed from Westerns. I think that is Japanese. There may be overlap, but I think that is from their traditional stories.
I kind of think the other way around. I think most of the cinematography and visual language comes from the Japanese film, but the story structure seems to come more from Westerns. I think it's the opposite. I'm not just saying that to be contrarian. That's kind of what I've been arguing this whole time. Is that like visually, obviously, most of these, well, why don't we limit to just film then? If we go back this far historically, you're kind of going outside my realm of expertise. Honestly, you may have a point with some of this stuff, but I mean, I could probably look up Japanese American stories from that time period that were quite common that maybe could have been spread to and arrived in Japan as well. And I guess the question is also, how much influence did each culture have on each other writing style wise with their writers back then? Was it as common as it is now? And we're talking like in the early 20th century, when most of these like stories, like the dime store westerns and a lot of these like samurai stories, probably I think like the early 20th century is when we probably want to say that this started, right? Do you think that the samurai stories were like the origin point, like the point of reference for these dime store westerns? Would you say that that's that's accurate?
Well, I would argue they sort of developed the same type of story independently. I can't honestly say that they were that heavily influenced by one another. I don't think the Japanese were that heavily influenced by Western stories of like cowboys. And I don't think the Americans were that influenced by samurai until later. But I know there's some overlap. Like I know like if certain time period, like if you're gonna watch movies, like you're watching westerns.
Mm-hmm. Here's a hot take. Maybe we're coming at this the wrong way. Maybe the question should be not were these influences happening back then, because I think at some point you have to agree that at some point there was a time when they were both influencing each other, these stories, right? Because there's too many similarities, there's too many remakes of each side, where like a Japanese will remake a Western story and a Western will remake a Japanese story. That has happened through the history of both samurai and cowboy films. At what point did they start really pulling from each other for those ideas? I think maybe the answer is World War II. Maybe after the war, both a lot of the American soldiers going over and being in Japan and experiencing the culture over there, and with a lot of the Japanese, people being under American occupational rule. Maybe that's when there's a lot more intermingling, and these stories kind of become intertwined and become connected so deeply, and the similarities became really more obvious. Maybe that's the actual answer. Maybe the original classic stories are not that close, but they just become the idea of the samurai and the cowboy became so, because the two nations after World War II, America and Japan have a very close relationship because of the situation that we were in. I mean, we were at war with each other. But after the war, I mean, we were essentially almost like the ruling government of Japan at that time, basically. We were their military. We were stationed over there. We were occupying their territory. They lost to us and they had to surrender to us. I think maybe there became some kind of reverence for American cowboys and a fascination. I mean, even if you want to, my reference is pro wrestling history. If you want to go back to pro wrestling history in the early post-war, early 50s era, one of the most popular villain type characters was like the American cowboy. Was super popular in Japan. It was like the American cowboy type character. which was a popular wrestler character in America, but in Japan it was like super, very much so like this is what people want to see the Japanese wrestlers wrestle. They want to see them wrestle the American cowboy, you know. So maybe there's something to be said that this we're maybe I'm coming at it from the wrong angle here, if that makes sense.
I I think that Japanese, especially, I would say specifically Kurosawa, that was sort of the main Japanese figure in film that got any sort of attention in Hollywood. The main thing was the Sergio Leone stuff, and that was pretty late in the 20th century before he sued and got credit for that. I don't think there was that much intermingling, just because of the nature of how Japan is. I know early on there was tension for sure. Like, I don't know exactly. I can only speak sort of anecdotally, because there were films made at the time by like Kobayashi, like Pigs in Battleships, about how much they hated the soldiers that were there. And you know, if you read Mishima, not a fan. Was not a fan of the occupying Americans. But there were films and stuff made. So I don't know if it was until like mid 20th century, maybe the 80s or the 90s, before the tension sort of subsided. So it's hard to say. But I know that Japanese films did show at art houses like in the 60s and 70s. But I wouldn't say it was mainstream. You sort of would have to seek it out.
Yep. Yeah,
it wouldn't have been like as accessible as like Fellini or Bergman, where it would have been even more around. Except maybe Kurosawa. Maybe Kurosawa was, but I don't know. I wasn't there.
Well, I mean,
so I can't say for sure.
Well, historically, at least from the American side, there was some fascination with Japanese culture after the war, because so many soldiers were over there, and this happened after Vietnam a little bit too. But so many soldiers who were over and did the Pacific. That's why there was kind of like also like a you know, tropical and Hawaiian, you know, like a tiki revival after the war too, because they brought a lot of their souvenirs back home. There's a lot of katanas brought back home. There's a lot of, you know, they ate Japanese cuisine while they were over there. Like there was a lot of a Japanese culture being brought back to America at that time. Whether it was as acknowledged as it is now historically, maybe not so much. But I mean, they definitely, at least on the American side, yeah. I mean, post-war, there's a lot of, maybe not directly post-war, but like in like the 50s especially, there was a lot of Japanese influence in American culture, but more so like, not like Japanese creators, right? Like not like Japanese artists having influence in America as much as, you know, the fascination with Japanese culture as a whole really started in America in that post-war era, right? Like that's when like the first hate to say the first weeaboos, right? The first people, all these, you know, soldiers, they come home and they got their trophies of war, and they got their kimonos and stuff. All that stuff they took back, and they bought like souvenirs for their families and stuff, and it became quite fashionable and interesting to have like these Japanese relics in their houses, you know, and they became.
And I know before World War II, like there was a somewhat close relationship between Japan and the USA. Like there was always that sort of fascination, and they had sort of a close.
Yep.
But I don't know how much is reciprocated. Because I mean, I'm not Japanese, so I don't know the how closely this was reciprocated.
I mean, it's less so much of the reciprocation more so imposed upon them. You know, I mean, they had American culture essentially imposed upon them from, you know, the late 40s onwards. I mean, that's like, you know, I mean, what kind of music were they listening to? Well, they probably had the music the soldiers had their bases. That's what they could listen to, or the movies they could have access to. And they had the Japanese films, but they probably also were mostly watching American movies, because that's what was shown for the American soldiers that were stationed there, right? And they were kind of at the mercy of that.
It's still, Japan's so weird. Like, they don't use Spotify. They still use CDs now. They just do their own thing. It's hard to say.
I mean, historically, Japanese culture was American culture, but 10 years later, right? Like in the Japan in the 80s was very much like America in the 70s and 60s, right? And same thing with the 70s. It was almost like they were doing the 50s America style. They were playing catch up. It was like a 10-year delay over there with their culture. But that doesn't mean that they weren't still. I think, at least from my experience from my knowledge of my limited knowledge of pro wrestling, which is actually one of the things that was extremely popular on TV in Japan at the time, there was a lot of American villains at the time. That was like one of the most popular bad guy foreign wrestlers were like American cowboys. So I think the cowboy was a fixture in their culture, not as a positive thing, but as a negative thing maybe. But that doesn't mean that they maybe wouldn't go. I think that there was a lot. I feel like Kurosawa probably watched a lot of John Ford movies. I don't think that's on. And I think, would you disagree with that? I think there's probably took some influence from some of those movies with what he was making.
Yeah, like I was saying, like definitely the cinematography and stuff. He would have had to see those films because there's definitely overlap.
Yeah. Well, I guess the real argument becomes what's better. Not which came first, which inspired what. What's really better? Are samurais better?
I think we would have to narrow it down a little bit, because if we use the samurai film, that's essentially just a period piece in a certain era, whereas a western's a more defined genre.
Sure. Okay. I mean, you can make an argument that there's a lot of westerns that are, there's like western horror movies and western romances and western dramas and western actions, but you're right that there's like a western style of story. But what's better? Geez, I think cowboys are better. I think they're more better. I think westerns are more interesting. I think even like the western remakes of samurai films I find more fascinating and interesting personally. Like I like the Magnificent Seven better than Seven Samurai. I think it's more interesting of a movie.
I like westerns. I'm not like super into westerns, but I do appreciate westerns quite a bit. But I like samurai films better, and a lot of them I find they're slower paced for sure. And that might be why you find the westerns more interesting.
It's at ADHD.
But I think the samurai films are just a lot more creative. Like there's a lot of samurai film. It should be really visually boring. So you have like people standing with sticks. But they always find a way. I mean, I can't speak of every samurai film ever made. But a lot of them find a way to make it very dynamic and visually interesting with something that should be very boring. Because it's a slow duel with sticks. And that's very interesting. And I think the way they hold the tension and how they hold the tension and how they can sort of, it's like a slow action movie essentially, rather than everything rushing so fast. A lot of times it's slow. It's not bang 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 everybody's dead. It's a slower sort of thing, because there are fast parts in samurai films when they're slashing through everyone, but a lot of it is build up and it's slower. Not to say that it's not in western films, that's part of it as well. Yeah. I just think it's a little bit more deliberate, and I appreciate that.
Just look in a samurai movie, there'll be the guy who'll, deliberately he will be walking, he'll have his robe flowing in the wind, and then suddenly he'll unsheath katana, teleports behind you, nothing personnel, kid, and that's how that's what you're talking about.
Well, like the movie Harakiri, directed by Masaki Kobayashi, the entire film is like a flashback and talking, and only at the end is there like a fight. The entire film is like a character study, and then there's a fight scene. It's not just about action or fighting. It's about something else. And yes, there's violence, and yes, there's other things, but it's still about something a little bit greater and a little bit more grand.
I suppose that's fair to say about some samurai movies. I feel like you can make an argument that Westerns tend to say a lot about the human condition, I feel, and they say quite a bit. I don't think it's fair to say that does. There's a lot of talking and deliberation in a lot of Westerns, too. But interesting point, interesting argument. I think that the Western, for me in film, has been the setting for... It's the structure that's created so many incredibly classic films that while I enjoy samurai movies, I don't think that there's a samurai movie that's in like my favorite movies of all time list. I don't think there's anything that's like... There may be like a good variety of movies that are quite enjoyable, but I think there's just like more... The Western has the ability to both be very mediocre and bad, but also truly exceptional. Right? It has the ability to create something truly excellent and incredible. I'm talking specifically like Searchers, True Grit, the Coen Brothers remake. I think that's my favorite Western, the Coen Brothers remake of True Grit. It's just such an incredible movie, that one. But you can do such a range of tones and styles. I mean, you can go comedic, you can go you can do comedic samurai movies too, but like it doesn't really hold as well as like a comedic Western. You can go comedic, you can go serious. It's such an iconic part of film history. I think it's just contributed so much more than the samurai film has, personally. But that's the way it's gonna be. I don't know. I just don't think there's just not quite as much as I like some good samurai movies or some good ones. I like the Lone Wolf and Cub series. It just doesn't hit the same as the cowboy on the horse. Nothing quite. The visuals and just the aesthetic, the look, the feel of it. It just better. Ranger, stop chewing on your bone, please.
I think a lot of the cowboy aesthetic in the cowboy films are about what to do with all this freedom and like dealing with the consequences of like all this freedom. While a lot of samurai films are about being constrained either by like the samurai code or whatever, and you're sort of boxed in what you're doing with.
Kind of like you're trapped.
Sort of like you're trapped. These constraints and how you
in a cube
live with them. And I don't know, maybe that's just me, but maybe in the in this modern world, this hard modern world, I relate more to the characters that are constrained, and I find their stories a little bit more interesting.
Interesting. It's a fair point. Maybe I just feel, maybe I kind of romanticize and want to live the experience more of having too much freedom. I want to imagine what that feels like.
So I do find westerns attractive for that reason, but I feel like the samurai films are almost more contemporary because of the way the characters feel constrained. In a lot of ways, it deals with the films, especially in that time period, are dealing with the way the Japanese people just feel sort of like they're going through the motions and they're sort of trapped by their history and what's going on contemporarily. And so I think that's sort of an interesting way to think about it. Well, I guess westerns are more of a celebration of history, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think they do kind of they glorify that period in our time. This very short, like, small period of American history, they glorify and idolize it for what it is. For what was essentially very, like, rough, transitional, like, dirty, awful period in American history, they glorify and elevate it to, like, this look and feel that's... I mean, it is quite... I mean, I think it's in some ways it's beautiful, in some ways it's kind of gross also to glorify this much violence, but I think it's kind of beautiful in a way. I don't know.
Because I mean, the samurai films, they certainly do glorify that period and all the violence and stuff, but there is a lot of them do have a very melancholy sort of quality. Probably because just from the nature of the job. because you have to, obey your lord no matter what, even regardless of how you feel about it.
Right. There's also the argument to be made that while the samurai film is very much constrained to that time period, the Western can kind of be set in a ton of different time periods. Like Roadhouse, we were just talking about this in the previous episode. Roadhouse, the Patrick Swayze film, is a Western for all intents and purposes.
Remember to subscribe and hit the notification bell to hear more about Roadhouse 2024.
But the original Roadhouse is a Western. So was like El Mariachi, or there's a decent amount. There's movies that are set not in the Western time period that that you can tell are visually and like structurally they're Western stories, right? They are the Western tale, and maybe that means, I think that kind of defines that the Western has become a genre of storytelling in and of itself that's almost separated itself from the time period. And maybe that's a strength. That's both a strength of the genre, but it may also be a weakness because the samurai film is so ingrained in that period, so visual. You can imagine what a samurai film is. It's so like tightly interwoven with that time period, you can't separate it. Whereas the Western, you could either set a movie in the Western time period, have it be a Western, or you can also make a Western style story set anytime, and it works both ways. Like No Country for Old Men is a Western. I mean, it is. It's a Western story. It's not set in the Wild West, but it is absolutely, like, story wise, it is.
I thought it was set in the Wild West. Isn't it like in Texas?
Well, Wild West being like it's wild, it's like untamed. It's like set in. It is set
pretty untamed when he's shooting holes in people.
And that's true. I mean, it is set in like that like geographic area, but it's not set in the same time. It's set in like the 70s or 80s, right? It's not set in the. It's like a modern.
Well, I feel Westerns have a lot in common with noir, to where it's sort of such a vague genre definition that sort of everything and nothing is noir, except for the actual films in that time period. And one could argue that the only good Westerns or noir are the ones actually in that time period.
You can make the argument for noir. I don't think I would make that argument for Westerns. I think some of the best Westerns aren't set in the Western time. No Country for Old Men, obviously, it's one of the better Westerns ever made, I would say, film wise. And it's definitely not set in the time period, but it definitely gives off like that feeling if you just watched a Western.
I mean, there's good neo-noir films, but most of them are shit.
That's true. We should make should we want to make a neo-noir film? Do I make like one of those Italian giallo neo-noir films that everyone talks about?
I feel like people think of the Western, but I think noir is like the quintessential American genre.
I don't agree with that. I think the Western is. I don't think the
I think it's more indicative of our culture than the Western is.
It's more indicative of the Northern culture, but boys down here in the South, we like our cowboy stories. You know what I'm saying? That's what we like.
Maybe noir is as we are, and Westerns are as we'd like to be.
Maybe. And Wild Wild West starring Will Smith is what we should be. We should be ashamed of.
We should be. The question is, why hasn't there been a movie with a cowboy and a samurai? Because they exist in the same time period.
It's a good question. They should do that. They should do like a Jackie Chan and Chris Tucker should like Rush Hour.
They should reunite at 80 years old on Jeffrey Epstein's island.
But they should do like a Rush Hour remake, but set it in the past, set in like the Wild West with a samurai coming in on like the train in California.
I like the idea of them at Jeffrey Epstein's island. That's sort of interesting.
Are they like there to like have sex with the children? Are they there to like get out, or like what's the plan?
And then we can have like that 90s where they cross dress for no reason.
But it's like a humiliation.
They have to infiltrate, and Jeffrey's like, "You look a little old for 13."
Oh, we Japanese.
It's an 80-year-old. He's an 80-year-old black man dressed up as a geisha. Chris Tucker could dress up as a geisha, and Jackie Chan could dress up like a black woman.
She could have blackface on. Oh my god. That sounds like a good movie.
And it's called Epstein's Finest.
Epstein's Finest. Okay. Or we could call it The Men of Little St. James.
We call it Big St. James.
Big St. James.
So there's a new thing in every episode. We're gonna riff a movie pitch.
Yeah, that's gonna be the new gimmick. That's how we're gonna close out the episode. Yeah.
No one cares about what we've been watching or doing. We're just gonna riff a beautiful.
We can't tell people
story.
that we just recorded this episode like a week after we recorded the last one, and we haven't seen anything new.
I saw The Sympathizer starring Robert Downey Jr. in his most Downey role yet.
Well, I guess this is the end of the episode. We're gonna call it here.
Do you want to make final points?
Yeah, I'll make my final points. Here's my final points. There is no samurai film as good as The Ridiculous Six, so Westerns win.
My final point was that I haven't seen that many Westerns. This conversation has encouraged me to go watch more Westerns. I criminally put me in jail. I don't think I've seen any John Ford films, which I really need to.
John Ford is interesting. He's I don't know if you'll like what he has to offer. I mean, it's paced very differently. I had trouble getting into liking John Ford when I first started watching in film school. They had me watch some of his stuff, but I've gone back and watched some of his stuff now, and I find it very interesting and entertaining. You have to be in the right frame of mind, but I mean, they're so like they're very like clinically well made movies, if that makes sense. It's almost like he's like it's like the Ford production line, right? It's like he's like making, which I know it's the Ford cars, but it's very much so the same thing where it's like he's just making the movies as they should be made. There's not really like a ton of artistic flourishes or stylizations. It's very much just, I'm going to present these movies. This is how we should shoot these movies. This is the best optimal way to shoot them. It's not like he's like thinking, oh, this is the. It's not like he's saying, this is going to make this shot. It means it's like this shot should be set like this, so we can do this. It's very old Hollywood, like textbook, but it also like comes off very like classy because of that too. If that makes sense. I don't know, they're good movies. They're very fun. The Searchers, Stagecoach is good. I'd recommend the original True Grit is also good. That's actually a good movie too.
I'd like to recommend some samurai movies for people to watch that are old and somewhat obscure. Probably not that obscure, but I think it's worth a shot.
It's called The Seven Samurai. No one's heard this movie.
I think Harakiri, directed by Masaki Kobayashi, is definitely one of my favorite films. I need to rewatch it soon. It's kind of an anti-samurai film. It's interesting. It's sort of criticizing the samurai edifice, but in a very interesting and creative way. One of my favorite films. Highly recommend it. I would say The Sword of Doom, which is a really wacky film. It's based on a book that everyone at the time had read, so there's like parts of it just missing. But it's like it's basically just a samurai who's just evil. He's just pure evil, and everything he does is evil. But it's really interesting cinematography and other goodies in that film. But even though there's supposedly parts missing, I mean, you don't really notice unless you've read the book.
Mm-hmm.
Which, I mean, I haven't. I didn't notice anything. It's really good. And definitely Ron. Akira Kurosawa's Ron. And Let's say Lady Snowblood. That's fun.
Lady
Everybody watches Kill Bill, but nobody says nobody watches the Lady Snowblood.
I think you should watch Kill Bill instead. It's a classic samurai movie by American director Quentin Tarantino. He know how to make better movie than Asian Khan. Ho he ho ho.
But yeah, definitely Harakiri, The Sword of Doom, Ron, and Lady Snowblood. Good samurai movies. If you're in the mood for that.
Okay. I also have a recommendation. I have the Lone Wolf and Cub series. Those are good movies. I actually really recommend those. Are good samurai movies. Fun fact with the Lone Wolf and Cub series, it's based off a manga, and that manga also inspired an American graphic novel, which was adapted into a film as well. It's not a Western though. It's actually a gangster film that was shot in Chicagoland area. It's called The Road to Perdition. And I think I'd recommend that movie if you're looking for a good Americanized samurai movie. It's set in a lot of different areas in Chicago. It's got Tom Hanks and Jude Law in it, and partially shot in Geneva, Illinois. Fun fact. So definitely go.
The best Americanized samurai movie is Jim Jarmusch's Ghost Dog. Don't at me.
Well, I don't think Ghost Dog was partially shot outside the Starbucks in Geneva, Illinois, so I don't know if it's as good as that.
Well, that's why it looked good.
That's why Road to Perdition did look good. You're right. That's why it did look good.
No, Ghost Dog looks good because it's not shot anywhere near Illinois.
Just Geneva, Illinois, specifically, where they shot the Road to Perdition. Tom Hanks.
You know, I'm out here trying to give people real samurai movie recommendations, and you're here just memeing all the time.
I'm a memer.
All the time.
I'm a memer. All right. Well, I'm a memer, and also I'm Big Baby. I'm Big Baby.
I'm Big Baby.
I'm Big Baby.
I'm Big Baby.
Bye.